All right, students, welcome to another week of this American soap opera called American History 1302. So, we just went over the progressive period, and it was just like the name says, a period of people who are trying to progress. But everything just dwindles down, everything kind of just dies down, and we're going to see why. We're going to be looking into this road to the war. Um, and it's a very sad period, not only in the United States, but in Europe. It was really just the really complete destruction of Europe, right? And we're going to be looking at these years between 1914 and 1920. Some of the focus questions we're going to be addressing are what caused this outbreak of the Great War and why? Why did the United States join the conflict? What was distinctive about fighting on the Western Front? We're going to see how did the Wilson administration mobilize the home front? How did these mobilization efforts affect American society? So, what was it like for the normal person? There's a war now, and how did it affect the regular people? What were the major events of the war after the United States entered the conflict? How did the American war effort contribute to the defeat of the Central Powers? Because we won, spoiler alert, we won this war. How did Wilson promote his plans for a peaceful world order as outlined in the 14 points? Were we part of the 14 points? What were the 14 points? How does peace look like? What were the consequences of the war at home and abroad? And as always, I give just a general overview of what the United States was going through. Throughout the 19th century, remember this Atlantic Ocean had protected America from fights in Europe. So we are a very strategic location where we have one ocean to the right, one ocean to the left, and they can't really get us, right? During the early 20th century, however, the nation's global isolation ended. Ever expanding world trade mixed in with the US interest with the international economy helped us bring ourselves in international markets. In addition, the development of steam powered ships and submarines meant that the foreign navies could directly threaten US security. So, with new powers, with new technology, we have to get out there. We have to protect our territory. At the same time, the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912 brought to the White House a self righteous moralist determined to impose his standards on what he saw, quote, renegade nations. This made the startling outbreak of the Great War in Europe in 1914 such a profound crisis for the United States. The First World War would become the defining event of the early 20th century. So this was the event, kind of like how COVID hit us, this was the event. For almost 3 years, President Wilson maintained America's stance of neutrality toward the war while providing increased amounts of food and supplies to Great Britain and France. So again, for the first for almost 3 years, President Wilson said, "Hey, we're going to be neutral. We're going to send you arms. We're going to provide food, supplies to Great Britain and France." In 1917, however, German submarine attacks on US ships forced Congress to declare war. Once America entered the war, almost 5 million men joined the military, including 400,000 African Americans and 150,000 Latinos, mostly Mexicans and Puerto Ricanos. A quarter of the draftees in 1918 were recent immigrants, including Germans who still spoke their native language. Immigrants continue to view military service as a pathway to citizenship and respect. Together and combined overall, US soldiers spoke 49 languages. That's how diverse it was. During one battle in France, German troops close enough to hear American soldiers talking to one another assumed they were Italians. So you see how the language was so diverse, but people were there so diverse. They were instead Italian immigrants from Manhattan. The departure of so many men from the civilian life opened new jobs for women and other men. So, for example, recruited by businesses and lured by the prospect of higher paying jobs, some 1.6 million, mostly rural African Americans, they moved to cities outside of the South to work in the defense industries in what became known as the Great Migration. African Americans were eager to escape the violent racism and this rigid structure of Jim Crow that they had endured in southern states. The Great War was so vast and destructive that it transformed the course of modern history. It redrew the map of Europe and also elevated the United States to a great power status. And it also introduced a brutal new era in which advances in military firepower, especially submarines, machine guns, massive cannons, tanks, and warplanes, increased the number of killed and wounded. So, as you can see, the Great War is not to be taken lightly. It affected both national and international affairs, right? It touched all the spectrums, right? So this theory or this practice of being neutral, that's out the window. America, and after the attack by the Germans, America had to, push forward to the war. And this lecture is how we're gonna get into the war. Woodrow Wilson. He once declared that he had, of course, you already know how he is. We've already talked about how he thinks, how he acts, how he does. And he said that he had, or he believed he had a first class mind. Of course, he was intelligent, he was thoughtful, he was courageous, but he didn't really have experience or the knowledge or the expertise in international relations. Quote, "It would be an irony of fate," he confessed, "if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs." Ironically, when this conflict erupted in Europe in 1914, he shifted his attention from these progressive reforms to foreign affairs. Lasting a little more than 4 years from 1914 to 1918, the Great War, and as future generations would call it, World War I, would involve more nations and cause greater destruction than any previous conflict. Now, let me give you some statistics. 20 million military and civilian deaths, 21 more wounded. This really big disaster, this global conflict, would take over monarchs, topple monarchs, destroy empires, create new nations, and it kind of really set the page for just an even more disastrous and costlier war in 1939, the second part to this World War II. Now, what is the background? How do we get into the Great War? Well, the Great War resulted from these long, simmering national rivalries and ethnic religious conflicts in Europe. Germany, determination to have its place in the sun at the expense of Great Britain, was only one of several threats to peace and stability. So, Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria Hungary, and Russia had long been competing for these global colonies. They were competing for markets, and such competition triggered a furious arms race that led to the creation of competing military alliances. So, these competition against these bigger nations, Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria Hungary, and Russia, led to them forming little groups. Well, not little groups, but military alliances. The Triple Alliance, called the Central Powers during the war, it consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire. So that's one. The Triple Entente, later called the Allied Powers, were composed of France, Great Britain, Russia, and later Italy. Let me tell you, some of these are going to change, okay? And some of these are going to even change greater in World War II. So, back to our teams. The members of these two alliances pledged to come to the defense of their partners should they be attacked, thus dividing Europe into two armed camps. In May 1914, Woodrow Wilson had sent his closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, to Europe to take the pulse of the rival nations, and he said that there is too much hatred and too many jealousies. So you can see it was a very, these two groups, these two powers, these two types of houses, these two types of groups, they really, really disliked each other and they were going at it. At the core of the tensions was the powder keg of Europe, the Austro-Hungarian or the Habsburg Empire, an unstable collection of 11 nationalities whose leaders were determined to suppress Serbia, their southern neighbor and long-standing enemy. So we're all clear up to that point, right? Serbian nationalists had long hoped to create Yugoslavia, a nation encompassing all ethnic Slavic peoples from throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia, home to millions of um, Slavs, supported the Pan-Slavic movement. Okay, everybody clear? Yes. Okay. A recklessly military Germany, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been a latecomer to industrialization and nationalization, having become a nation only in 1871. Its leaders urged or wanted to catch up to Great Britain and France. Germany had created its own colonial empire in Africa and Asia while building a powerful navy enough, really big and really, enough to challenge British supremacy, and an army capable of defeating its old enemies, the Russian Empire and France. So again, these factors, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, created a combustible situation. So it was very close to fire, something that could be ignited and poof, explode. All that was really needed was just a spark. The Balkan Peninsula, a volatile region of the southeastern Europe and on the southern border of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, provided that spark. There, for centuries, the Austrian and the Russian monarchies had competed with the Turkish-led Ottoman Empire for control. 6 years before, in 1908, Austria had annexed Bosnia from the Ottoman Empire, infuriating Serbian nationalists. And watch this. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his pregnant wife Sophie, paraded through the Sarajevo, the capital of the Austrian-controlled Bosnia, in an open car. And here I provided a map of these European nations because I know there's so many that we are going to be talking about. So go ahead and take your picture or use this as an example. You have here the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have Italy, you have the Russian Empire, France, Great Britain. So this is a section that we're going to be talking about here, and this map lays it out really well, which the Allied powers, central and the neutral countries. Um, so take a picture of that, and as we're going through the slides, use this as a reference as our story continues. So we're talking about Franz Ferdinand and his pregnant wife Sophie, and they were paraded through the capital of Austria-controlled Bosnia, Sarajevo, in an open car. When the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn and was forced back to put the car down a crowded street, Gavrilo Princip, a just mad 19-year-old Serbian nationalist, shot and killed the imperial couple. Oof. To avenge the murders, Austria-Hungary, with Germany's approval, resolved to bring Serbia under its control or destroy it. Kaiser Wilhelm was willing to risk a massive war in the belief that it was best to strike before the Russians could build up their military power. Okay, what happens next? The dude gets shot. Ugh, not bad news. Remember, I told you it just needed a little spark? Well, this was a spark. And with a blank check of German support, Austria-Hungary issued deliberately unreasonable ultimatums. It was pissed. Serbia agreed to most of them, but Austria-Hungary still mobilized for the war. A flurry of diplomacy failed to break the deadlock, and on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia. They responded by mustering its army to defend Serbia. And of course, triggering reactions by other members of the rival European military alliances. So once Russia said, hey, we're going to mobilize our army, we're going to defend our little brother Serbia, the other group said, Uh-uh. It will be a hopeless struggle, predicted the head of Austria's armed forces. But it must be pursued because so old a monarchy and so glorious an army could not go down ingloriously. So these are fighting words. German leaders had a different outlook, expecting a limited war and a quick victory. They declared war on Russia on August 1st, 1914, and on France 2 days later. So Germany said, oh, no, we got this. We're going to beat them. Nah, little fight, little tag team fight right here. And they said, we're going to declare war. And they did so on August 4th, 1914. And they also declared war on France just a couple of days later. German troops then invaded neutral Belgium to get at France, murdering or deporting thousands of civilians in the process. This quote, you know, this takeover on Belgium brought Great Britain into the war. On August 4th, on the Western Front, and the battle line in North France and Belgium. So as you can see, people started to be up in arms, right? They started to raise militaries and they started to declare war on each other on a sprawling eastern front. Now we're going to look at the eastern front. Look at your maps. Russian armies clashed with German and Austro-Hungarian forces, as well as those of the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire. Within 5 weeks of the assassination, the Great War was threatening the stability of the whole world. So as you can see the impact, think about it like this, even in today's age, today's day and age. So, and this is just an example. This war that that I just created in my head, it's not real and it's not going to be real, right? It's just something that I'm saying so you can measure the bigness of these alliances and the scariness of these alliances waging war at each other. And we're gonna use Americas as an example. So think about it. Uh, and this is in no way, shape real. This is just make up so you can see. So let's say Mexico and Canada are teaming up together. And then the United States says, we're gonna declare war on Canada. And Mexico says, no, 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 you're not. And then Mexico brings then let's say the United States is friends with Central Americans, and the Central Americans start preparing for war, and then Mexicans start preparing for war, and then Canadians start preparing for war, and then Brazil said, "Oh no, we're Team Mexico," and think about it as this whole set of countries, just big and bad at moving weaponry and moving navies and moving submarines, and it was really an ugly picture to see at the time. And this war was a very big war in that it was one of the first wars that used a different set of technology. The Great War was an industrial war, and it was fought between nations using this new weaponry that dramatically increased the destruction of people. So big tech, big industrialization, big innovation that attacked large masses of people. Machine guns, submarines, aerial bombings, poison gas, flamethrowers, land mines, mortars, long range artillery, and armored tanks changed the nature of warfare and produced immense amount of casualties and widespread destruction. A slaughter that is even unimaginable in today's day and age. So big machines killing massive amount of people. Of the approximately 70 million soldiers and sailors who fought on both sides, more than half were killed, wounded, imprisoned. or unaccounted for. It was the mechanized weaponry that made possible such mass killings on an industrial scale, the same scale on which items were mass produced in an industrial economy. Mass mobilization of economies and civilians was required to assemble such vast armies and achieve these unprecedented levels of industrial production. So there's a lot of things that stand out in World War One, and one of these things that are kind of like the emblem or something that is there was known for was this trench warfare. And in the early weeks of the war, German armies swept through across Belgium and northeastern France, only to bog down in this nightmarish trench warfare that came to symbolize a brutal war of futility. So both sides dug in and fought a grinding war and sometimes gaining little territory in the process. The US ambassador in London let President Wilson know that the horror of the conflict outruns all imagination. During 1914 through 1915, the two sides, the two competing groups, built a network of zigzagging trenches from the coast of Belgium, some 460 miles across northeastern France to the border of Switzerland. These trenches, they could measure up to 40 feet deep and were frequently carpeted with mud. And let me tell you, infested with rats and lice. Quote, when all is said and done, grumbled an English infantry soldier, the war was mainly a matter of holes and ditches. Soldiers often ate, they slept, they lived, and they died without ever leaving these underground dugouts. A French soldier described life in these trenches as a physical, almost animal existence in which the primitive instinct of the race had full sway. Eating, drinking, sleeping, fighting, everything but loving. The object of trench warfare was not so much to gain ground as it was to inflict death and destruction on the enemies until its resources were exhausted. So there was a purpose for these trench warfare. Again, it was really to inflict death and really to kill and just, be destructive to the enemy until its resources were exhausted, till they had no more resources. In one assault against the Germans in Belgium, the British lost 1,300 men in 3 hours and gained only 100 yards. As the war ground, or as a war continued, both sides found themselves using up their available men, resources, courage, and cash. The Great War, mourned a German soldier, had become the grave of nations. Throughout 1914, both sides talked about the glory and glamour of war. So again, this was 1914, and they talked about, kind of this pride in the war and glory in the glamour of war. Captain Julian Grenfell, a poet, was giddy after his first combat. I adore war, he wrote to his parents. It is like a big picnic. I've never been so well or so happy. The fighting excitement vitalizes everything, every sight and action. One loves one fellow's man so much when one is bent on killing him. Now, let me tell you, 5 months later, a piece of A piece of weaponry hit Grenfell in the head, and he died 13 years later. So, as a casualty soared, notions of this romantic glory died with them. British poet Wilfred Owen called the idealization of combat the old lie. And he would be killed in action in 18, just a week before the war ended. So, really sad. The traditional glorification of military combat disintegrated as soldiers died like cattle in slaughterhouses, killed often as such long distances that they never saw their opponent. So, there was this component in the beginning where, like I said, 1914, where there was this honor and glory to serve in the war, but all of that flushed away because the war was painful, the war was sick, the war was violent. What the military leaders failed to envision was the scale of devastation that the new weaponry enabled. Long range artillery, machine guns, grenades, poison gas, tanks, warplanes, and more accurate and rapid firing rifles created killing zones, no man's land, more than 1,000 yards deep, across which attacking soldiers were ordered to advance. And there's this very hellish nature of these trenches and the warfare that it imposed a big and extraordinarily psychological challenges for both soldiers on both sides. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fell victim to this shell shock, and we know it now as post-traumatic stress disorder. And these are the quotes of a nurse, and she said, "It was a very horrible thing. They became quite unconscious with violent shivering and shaking." So, what we now know as PTSD, they knew as shell shock, right? And of course, it was horrible. Imagine being, you know, almost all hours of the day in the trenches. You live there, you eat there, and there's rats, there's the mud, there's gangrene gangrene feet. So it was really just terrible, terrible, terrible place to be in. When war erupted in Europe, American officials were stunned, they were shocked. One of the president's cabinet members remembered that the end of things had come. "I stopped in my tracks, dazed and horror stricken, but shock mingled with relief that a wide ocean stood between America and the killing fields." So this was a really big advantage and continues to be a big advantage even in today. Well, let me take that back, because now there's so many different military attacks, right? But during this time, the ocean was just a big barrier in protection. President Wilson maintained that the United States was, quote, "too proud to fight in Europe's war." He said, "with which we have nothing to do, whose causes cannot touch us." He repeatedly told Americans and urged Americans to remain neutral in thought as well as in action. But that's just the outside. Privately, however, he sought to ensure that the United States could provide Great Britain and France with as much financial assistance and supplies as possible. So, okay, yeah, for the public facing comments, yes, we have to remain neutral. Yes, we have to, you know, yeah, be neutral in thought as well as in action. But behind closed doors, he really wanted to provide Great Britain and France, which is much financial assistance with food, with supplies, right? He really wanted to bulk them up. Of course, they were our allies. So, how does the United States support its allies, or how did that come to be? Well, by the spring of 1915, the Allied powers needed food, they needed supplies, they needed weapons, which all of this generated a boom for US businesses, for bankers and farmers. How so? Well, efforts to France and Great Britain quadrupled from 1914 to 1916, and America's manufacturing capacity soon surpassed that of Great Britain, which was a world leader in that. So now that France and Europe and the whole and Britain and the whole European nations were at war, well, Britain and France needed to send their men to fight in the war. So they turned to the US, right, for help, for additional help as far as um, loans and food supplies. So farm income soared 25% in the United States. The Allies, especially Britain and France, needed loans from US banks or these credits from US governments, which would allow them to pay for their purchases later, right? So all of this really helped um, the United States commerce, right? And just another quick fact, because I find this super interesting, banks and other investors would eventually send more than $2 billion to the Allies before the United States entered the war. So there was a lot of movement of money in this specific period. The United States provided more than just material aid to the Allies. Thousands of men and women volunteered in the British, Canadian, and French militaries. The French Foreign Legion, the American Ambulance Field Corps, military, hospitals, and various refugee relief organizations. So the United States, um, thousands of men and women volunteered in these organizations. In October 1914, the first American Red Cross ship arrived in France, carrying 170 doctors and nurses. So that's a really big amount. Some volunteers sought adventure or glory. Others were eager to fight this German imperialism, and others, their ideology was that they were wanting to repay France for its support to the America for support during for America during the Revolutionary War. So, um, France has been the United States' longest ally, and that is a fact. Almost 300 volunteers served as pilots in an all-American aviation unit in France called the Lafayette Escadrille. Some 4,000 Native Americans, still not granted citizenship in the United States, volunteered in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Theodore Roosevelt's son, Kermit, used his father's help to gain a commission as a captain in the British Expeditionary Force in France. By 1916, some 45,000 Americans were serving as volunteers in Allied hospitals in France and England, or as soldiers or pilots on the Western Front. So, in addition to aid, there were a lot of volunteers who served in various organizations. What makes things get really serious? There's always a moment where it's quiet and people gasp and go, ah, what was that moment? Well, with its warships bottled up by a British blockade for its port, the German government announced a war zone around the British Isles. All ships in those waters would be attacked by submarines, the Germans warned. And they said it may not always be possible to save crews and passengers. So that's kind of like a big threat. But hold up, wait. The German use of the submarines or the U boats, which is this interesting word that I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it well. Those who speak German, please correct me if I'm saying it right or wrong. The Unterseeboote, it violated the long established wartime custom of stopping an enemy vessel and allowing the passengers and the crew to board lifeboats before sinking it. So let me repeat that again a little bit slower. So the German use of these submarines or U boats violated the long established wartime custom of stopping an enemy vessel and allowing the passengers and crew to board lifeboats before sinking it. And remember, Germany was saying, was quite threatening, saying it may not always be possible to save your crews and passengers. During the 1915, German U-boats sank 227 British ships in the Atlantic and the North Ocean. President Wilson, he warned German leaders that he would hold them to strict accountability for the loss of any American lives and property. Then, on May 7th, 1915, a German submarine off the Irish coast filed or fired a single torpedo that sank the British passenger ship Lusitania. It was the largest, fastest, and most luxurious ocean liner in the world. Now, guess what? Of the 1,198 people on board who died, 128 were Americans. Uh-oh. The sinking of the Lusitania, asserted Theodore Roosevelt, called for an immediate declaration of war. Wilson, however, urged patience. He said, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right." Uh-oh. Wilson's earlier threat of strict accountability now required a tough response. On May 13th, Secretary of State Bryan demanded that the Germans stop unrestricted submarine warfare, apologize, and pay the families of those killed on the Lusitania. The Germans countered that the ship was armed, which was false, and secretly carried thousands of cases of rifles and ammunition, which was true. They further declared that it was transporting hundreds of Canadian soldiers, which was true. On June 9th, Wilson dismissed the German claims and reiterated that the United States was, quote, contending for nothing less high and sacred than the rights of humanity. Bryan resigned as Secretary of State in protest of Wilson's pro British stance, despite his claim of neutrality. And one thing about Bryan is that he was he believed in neutrality, right? He's a pacifist. Stunned by the global outcry of this Lusitania sinking, the government told its U-boat captains to stop attacking passenger vessels. Despite the order, a German submarine sank the British liner Arabic, and 2 Americans on board were killed. The Germans paid a cash penalty to the families of the deceased and issued what came to be called as the Arabic Pledge on September 1st, 1915, and it said, liners will not be sunk by our submarines without warning and without safety of the lives of non-combatants, provided that the liners do not try to escape or offer resistance. In early 1916, and things are getting a little bit more tense by this point for Americans. In 1916, Wilson again sent Colonel Edward House to London, Paris, and Berlin in hopes of trying to stimulate these peace talks, but he didn't succeed. And the killing continued. On March 24th, 1916, a U-boat sank the French passenger ferry Sussex, killing 80 passengers and injuring 2 Americans. After Wilson threatened to end relations with Germany, its leaders again promised not to sink merchant or passenger ships. The Sussex Pledge implied the virtual abandonment of submarine warfare. Colonel House noted in his diary that Americans are now beginning to realize that we are on the brink of war and what war means. So, like I said, Germany is really just out there shooting and shooting and shooting, and they just keep on saying, yes, I pledge, I will not do this again, but they still keep on doing it. So, where do you think this is going to lead? And because of time, I'm going to have to cut this section a little bit shorter because we're going to focus on other things in this road to World War One. So there's a couple of things I want you to just know for this specific area. So the US starts preparing for war, and Wilson wins the 1916 election. And now what happens after that? And this was a re-election year, and Wilson again, he wins and he urges these nations in Europe to, hey, let's negotiate a peace without victory. But this was just not going to happen. Now, we've been talking about this road. We've been talking about these close encounters that we've had. Now, on February 3rd, keep that in mind, President Wilson informed Congress that he had formally ended diplomatic relations with the German government to preserve, quote, the dignity and the honor of the United States. Guess what? 3 weeks later, on February 25th, he learned that the British had intercepted, watch this, a coded telegram from Germany's Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico City. Now, check this out. The telegram said that Germany would begin unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st. If war erupted with the United States, the ambassador was instructed to offer the Mexican government an alliance. If the US entered the war in Europe, Mexican forces would invade the United States. In exchange, Germany would return to Mexico its lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. On March 1st, newspapers broke out this news of the notorious Zimmermann telegram. The Mexican government immediately disavowed any support to the Germans. But the Germans attempted to recruit Mexico as an ally, infuriated Americans that many called for a war. Now check this out. I put here this this telegram, right? And if you look at it closely, if you analyze it closely, what are some of the things that you see? Western Union telegram to to Mexico City, but it was sent via Galveston. So I find that to be so interesting that in our backyard, this big historical telegram passed in our area. Super interesting. On March 1917, German submarines torpedoed 5 U.S. ships in North Atlantic, and for Wilson, this was it. This was the last straw. On April 2nd, he called on Congress to declare war against the German empires and its allies, and in one of his greatest speeches, Wilson acknowledged that it was just a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, but that the world must be made safe for democracy. He warned that winning the war would require mobilizing all material resources of the country and millions of military recruits to bolster the armed forces. The nation's motives, he insisted, were pure. The United States was now entering a war not so much to defend its honor as to lead a great crusade for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its people. Congress erupted with approval. And America's long embrace of isolationism was over. They were now part of World War I.